Currently still on page 66, chapter 15, talking about the possibility of a person who is so spiritually advanced and yet not serving Hashem. I think it was quite a powerful session last week where we spoke about the idea that you could plateau, that you could become a spiritual has-been. Not anybody at this table, obviously, but just, theoretically, where a person can reach a point where you've worked and worked and worked on spiritual development, and then you get to a stagnation. You get to say, okay, this is me, I've done, look at me, I'm good, I've achieved, and so on and so forth. And then a person feels that they don't have to progress any further, and more importantly, they feel they no longer have to fight because they're in a good holding pattern. Things are healthy, things are the way that they should be. I've conquered my demons, I've climbed my mountain, all the cliches that people use. And now I'm in a really good place, and I don't have to look any further. So we said last week that that's a very unhealthy place for an individual to be, no matter how spiritually advanced they are, because that becomes a barrier to real, not growth, but to service of Hashem.
But you also go backwards. You can't
Correct.
stand still.
Correct. You can't stand still. But the point that's relevant to us, the point that we're focused on over here is you're not serving Hashem at that point, and that's what we're here for. We're here to serve Hashem. So we're going to develop that concept further this evening, and in doing so, we're going to introduce an idea which is right back from the time of the Gemara and fine-tuned over here in the book of Tanya 200 some years ago. And in today's world, everyone's going to say, well, of course, because in today's world, everybody will tell you about the tipping point and about quantum leaps and about exponential growth and about atomic habits. All these expressions that people use, which effectively say small things that are big things. Well, guess what? This is ancient Jewish wisdom, and it's not a big surprise to us that people are teaching these kinds of things, because at the end of the day, we know this. We know this in our bones. We know that this is true. And what we're going to learn this evening, I'm sure if we had a good marketing team, we could come up with a really good line and then package this and sell it and make a whole lot of money. But essentially what we're going to learn is that there is a period or a stage of a person's development where everything is very calibrated and very, step by step, into incremental. And then there gets to be a tipping point where everything changes. It's like warp speed. Now you're moving in a whole different direction. And the wisdom that we're going to learn this evening is so profound because people don't consider the incredible power of one step. But the thing is, it's not the one step at the beginning of the journey. That's what everybody teaches us. Everybody teaches us about the power of that one step at the beginning of the journey, which is a big deal, and we speak about it a lot in Judaism. In fact, there's a whole philosophical debate within Torah about whether it is that initial step, either in a healthy or an unhealthy direction, that weighs the same as all the subsequent steps that follow or not. Because really, if you think about it, it's that original breach in the negative, or it's that original reach in the positive that really makes all the difference. Because until you've done that thing, nothing can move. So we speak so much about the initial step. And it's really, really important. The Gemara, for example, tells us, Kol hascholos koshois, that any process at its start is a very difficult process. Because you've got to somehow create that momentum, right? And we know that even from physics. In order to generate initial momentum, takes a lot of effort, a lot of expenditure of energy in order to get things moving. And then you start to build momentum until the point that you can actually freewheel. So we're very used to the idea that an initial step is a big step. An initial step is a scary step. An initial step changes everything. And that's true. That's absolutely true. It's just not what we're going to focus on tonight. Tonight we're going to learn something altogether different. It's not just the initial step that's such a big deal. It's the first step you make after comfort. That's the biggest deal. Meaning, Let's say that a person decides, and I'll use an example which is not related to spirituality, but just to illustrate the point. Let's say that a person decides that they're going to start a business. Now, starting a business is incredibly difficult. There are many challenges. There are many naysayers. There are many hoops that you have to jump through. It's not so simple to start a business. And for that reason, a person might talk about it, but not action it because they're afraid what happens if I start that process and it fails. So what will we tell them? We'll say, just do it. Just get started. Take the first step. Because we know that once they break through that psychological barrier, and once they break through that physical barrier, things will begin to happen. Now, I don't know if you've seen, but recently on this street over here on Grayson, there's a big electronic billboard, and one of the adverts that they've had recently is a Nike ad.
Just do it.
No, it's not. Not just do it. It's a new Nike ad. It says, hate the first kilometer, love the last kilometer. You seen it? Hate the first kilometer, love the last kilometer. So it's obviously talking about the person who's running a marathon or doing a longer run as part of the exercise. The reality is getting started is not a comfortable process, and you hate that process because you got to break out of the complacency, you got to break out of the warmth of the and comfort of your bed. You got to actually get on the road, and you actually got to start running. It's true. Hate the first kilometer. Kol ascholos koshes. All initial processes are difficult processes. The mistake that people make, which in a sense might even be more of a mistake than not getting out of the starting blocks, is when things begin to happen. And when there is smooth sailing, now you love the last kilometer. In other words, you're glad that this is the last kilometer. You're loving that exhilarating feeling of, I can see the finish line, I can see I'm almost back home, and I'm going to be able to have that breakfast that I promised myself.
Then it's a plateau that you're eating.
Correct, exactly. So the question is, which is the bigger achievement? The first step, which is a massive achievement, or the first step after success? Interesting, right? Which means, let's say that I achieve success. Let's go back to the business idea. So here's the person, it's really difficult. They're starting their business and they've got to go through all these checks and balances, and they've got to get investors, and they've got to hone the idea so that it actually makes sense. And then they've got to get the staff, and they've got to get the stock or whatever it is that they need in order to get the business. And it's a really, really challenging experience. It rips your guts out for the first, people think 6 months, and it turns out to be 6 years. And it's really, really hard. And eventually that business becomes a success story. Such a great success story that other people are saying, wow, look at you, and please can you teach us what's your secret? How did you do this? Etc. That person now, what are the chances that they'll now go and start another different business? So you get people who are like that. They're very entrepreneurial, and they serial business starters. Fine. It's not common. Why? Because the first step after success is in many respects even more difficult than the first step of first steps. Which means it's always relative value to challenge. So taking the first step was a huge challenge. The relative value is, I'm going to succeed. Taking the first step after you've already succeeded means that the potential for growth, for success, for development, for etc. is even greater. And that's essentially the principle we're going to learn about spirituality. That as long as a person creates a holding pattern, as long as a person creates some kind of repetitive loop, some kind of protocol that works for their spirituality, then they get stuck in that protocol.
But you need that loop.
Nobody's dismissing the value of routine. Nobody's dismissing the value of of creating habits that are healthy habits. We even spoke about this last time. We spoke about it becomes teva sheni, it becomes your second nature. And we said that is a great place to be, but it's not serving Hashem. See, the fact that I need to have habit, the fact that I need to have systems that work, services me. It doesn't service Hashem. It doesn't service the purpose.
So
So-
us getting out on a winter day, we are pushing ourselves.
Well, you've got to ask yourself, if you get out on a winter's day, is that your first step, or is that your first step after success? It's definitely worthwhile. It's definitely difficult. So therefore it's uphill. And if it's uphill, it's challenging. And if it's challenging, then the value that you're going to get from the challenge is greater than if there had been no challenge, right? But is it your first step, or is it your first step after success? What do you say? There's no last step in Torah learning. The more you learn, the more you see that you need to know to get closer to Hashem. Well, I think that is true. And yet, at the same time, it's not entirely true. What I mean by that is, of course it's true. If I learn Torah, the more I learn, the more I realize how much there is to learn, and the more I appreciate how little I know. So that's going to obviously prompt me to learn more. More is a sometimes misleading term. In other words, let me explain to you what I mean by that. Let's say, and this is going to speak directly to what we're going to learn about tonight. Let's say that you have completed a particular area of Torah study. So, of course, a lot of people are very into learning Gemara. It's considered to be, like the flagship of all Torah learning. So people get very excited about the fact that they've completed a tractate of Gemara. What does it say? Because there's a little, I don't want to say the word prayer, it's not exactly the same, it's what we call a siyum, that at the conclusion of a tractate of Gemara, you're supposed to read a few paragraphs that speak about the value of Torah learning, etc. Now, we call it, colloquially, we call that a siyum. You heard that expression, a siyum. What does the word siyum mean?
An end.
Conclusion, right? Conclusion. What's the correct term for it? If you look in the back of the Gemara, it's called a hadron. That's what it's called, a hadron. Hadron is an Aramaic word, and it comes from the sentence that we read as soon as we finish a Gemara. The sentence says, Hadron aloch maseches whatever. Now, most people translate that as, I have now concluded Tractate X, which is a terribly inaccurate translation. Hadron aloch means, I pledge to return to you. Tractate X. In other words, the very first thing that a person does as they conclude a Gemara is they make a verbal commitment to come and learn it again. Now, if the whole purpose of knowing the depth and the infinity of Torah would be to realize there's more to learn, then I'd say, okay, I've done this book. Look how many more books there are on the shelf. I mean, look at this. All these books, right? I need to get on to the next book. There's pressure over here. What do we say? I'm going to come back and learn the same material again. We do exactly the same thing on Simchas Torah. Simchas Torah, the entire Jewish community gets together. We have a massive celebration with singing and dancing and food and drink. Why? Because we've completed a whole cycle of reading the Torah. But what do we do before we have all the celebration and what do we do? We start it again. Start it again. The same book. Why don't you move on now to the prophets? Just read the 5 books of the Torah. There's all the books of the prophets. Why don't you go to no? Go back and start the same thing again. Why? Why is that? Why do we do that? So that's part of what we're going to explore this evening, which is this incredible principle of exponential growth and what we call real service of Hashem, which of course is the point that we're trying to focus on. So if you have a look at page 66, we are just over halfway down the page. We're going to be looking at the first word of the particular line. So I'd say it's about 3-4 lines after the midpoint of the page. The word you're looking for is the word uvazeh. Uvazeh. See that? And if you're looking on the screen, it is the second last line on the screen and the first word of the line, uvazeh. So with the information that we have now learned, which is that it is possible for an individual to be in an extremely high, elevated spiritual position where they are free of sin and completely dedicated to everything that Hashem wants, and yet at the same time not to be considered a servant or somebody who is serving Hashem. Why? Because they're not really pushing themselves and they're just in some kind of a comfortable loop. Uvazeh, with that information, Yuvan Mashakosa B'Gemara. We'll be able to understand what is stated in the Gemara. What does the Gemara say? So remember that we started this chapter by quoting a Gemara, right? That's how we began. We said there's a Gemara that tells us that based on the verse says, "V'shaftim or isim," that you should pay attention and see Bein oived Elokim la'asher loy avodoi. What's the difference between somebody who is serving Hashem and the individual who has not yet served Hashem? The Gemara has an interpretation of what that means. You ready for it? Here's the interpretation. Says the Gemara, the oived Elokim, a person who is serving Hashem, hainu mishishoyne pirkoi mea pe'omim ve'echad. That refers to somebody who reviews their studies 101 times. Ve'lo yavodoi, and the interpretation of somebody who has not served Hashem, hainu mishishoyne pirkoi mea pe'omim levad. That is somebody who has only reviewed their study 100 times. Okay, so before we start unpacking the lesson, let me ask you a simple question. Can you think of anything in your life that you have reviewed 100 times? For real. Not just as an exaggerated statement. Oh, I've done this 1,000,000 times already.
Maybe
Actually reviewed 100 times. Never in 1,000,000 years does a student before exams review their information 100 times. Never. What do you review 100 times? In fact, let's take this a step further. For most of us, and the same would apply to our kids, we are very quick to say, oh, I know that. I've heard that already. I've learned that already. Can we not do something else? For example, once upon a time, there used to be a member of this community, who unfortunately is no longer with us. If I repeated something on a Friday night that I had said years earlier, he'd come over and say, I remember the last time you said that. And it was quite irritating because, you don't want to have that kind of reminder. You want people to think, oh, wow, this is so amazing. It doesn't matter that you said it last week. So what? Say it again. But this particular person, he would remember. He'd say, I remember you said it and this was the context and whatever the case is. So, okay, so you remember that I said it. Does that mean I'm never allowed to repeat it again? That's not how learning works. Learning is not that every single time that you encounter something, it has to be fresh material. That's not learning, that's entertainment. That's TikTok. If I see something that's a little bit familiar, swipe through it and go to the next thing.
You're always going to get something different every time you hear something.
Well, it's not a guarantee, but hopefully you will.
Yeah.
Hopefully you will, right?
Or
So
remind you of something that you needed to readdress.
Right? So that's learning. Learning is not always new material. Learning is new insight into material that you've already learnt. What do we call the central body of halachic literature that the whole Talmud is built on? What do we call it? The Mishnah. What does Mishnah mean? Comes from the word, what he just said over here, Lishanot, to repeat. V'shinantam levanecha, to repeat. Because that's how learning is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a repetitive process. I remember once in yeshiva, so the Alter Rebbe who wrote Tanya also wrote a series of discourses on the parasha of the week. Very beautiful and very concise. So there's a tremendous amount of information packed into relatively short discourses on the parashas of the week. It's in 2 books. One is called Torah Or, and the other is called Likutei Torah. So I remember once in yeshiva, there was a very smart young man who was studying with us, and he went to raise a complaint with one of the rabbis. Because in Chabad, you're supposed to study at least some of these discourses on a weekly basis. It's on the parasha of the week. You're supposed to study it. So he came to complain to one of the rabbis. He said, I've been going through these books with all these profound discourses, but at the end of the day, they all essentially speak to the same theme. He says, where's the diversity? Where's the innovation? Where's the freshness? It's the same topic again and again, the same theme. Needless to say, the rabbi he addressed this question to didn't take his criticism very lightly, and basically said, well, you've essentially missed the whole point of what Judaism is. Judaism is one message that is just repeated in millions of different ways. The one message is Hashem echad u'shmoi echad. There's one God, and that's it. That is the message of the whole of Judaism. And everything else is just re-sharing that same information from different perspectives and different angles. Because learning something again and again and again is what consolidates the information. It's what gives us a true understanding of that information. Again, like I said, we're talking over here about ancient wisdom. This is the Gemara that was written, a millennium and a half ago, teaching things that in today's world, every self-help book thinks they've told you something brand new. So in today's world, what's the big wisdom? The 10,000 hour rule. Right? Which essentially means if you keep doing the same thing again and again and again and again, eventually when you accumulate 10,000 hours of repeating the same kind of activity, you become you become proficient, you become an expert, you become a leader in that particular area. So that's why, for example, I'll tell the story that Bill Gates, as a young nerd, used to sit on his, I think it was his uncle's computer or something like that, and he used to fiddle and play around, and other people didn't have access to computers, so they didn't get the same kind of experience that he had, 10,000 hours experience. So next thing became Bill Gates. Okay, obviously there's more to the story than that, but you understand the principle. Here the Gemara is saying, as a matter of course, that if a person does not review their studies 101 times, they are not serving Hashem. Now, as I asked right at the beginning, how many times do we ever review anything that we've studied? How many times? 2, 3, 5, 10, 20 times. Can you imagine relearning the same information 20 times? It's like, I'll take it from another perspective. In Chabad, we have a system where you learn a bit of Tanya every single day. So it's split. You can even look in the book and you'll see that there's an assignment for a date. On every single page, there's an assignment for 1 or 2 dates of the allocation of Tanya that you're supposed to learn. Let's say that you do this every single year. Or let's say that you follow along every single week on the parasha, right? So you followed the parasha every single year of your life. You're still not close to 100 times. And that might be the part of Judaism that we review the most. Because it's like in our blood, the parasha of the week. Every single week it comes around. The Pesach story. How well do we know the Pesach story? How many times have we told the Pesach story? How many times? 50 times. 60 times. How many people on planet Earth will ever relate the Pesach story 100 times? Okay, it helps if you're outside of Israel because you have 2 days, you have 2 Seders, right? Okay, so maybe you'll get to 100 times of telling the story.
You've got to live to about 113, 114.
No, so there's 2 nights. There's 2 nights of the Pesach Seder, right?
Yeah,
so you need 50 years of doing the Pesach Seder. You'll have repeated the story 100 times. So maybe that's the one thing that will get to, seriously speaking, 100 times. But we have a problem. That they had a different problem to what we have. What I guess we believe was their problem. They would look at us and say, we have a different problem. What's the problem we have? We have the internet. The single biggest one, I don't know, maybe AI is now the single biggest cause of nobody learning anything. Why do I have to learn something if I could just speak to my phone and I'll get all the information, much more than I could ever have learned in a lifetime? So we have what we think is a tremendous asset, and it is, if used appropriately, it is. And at the same time, we have a tremendous problem. I'm sure I told you the story once before, that I once had an opportunity many years ago. There was an individual visiting here in South Africa, and he's a well-known, I don't know if he's still on stage, but he was a well-known mentalist. He happened also to be from Yid. And he was performing in South Africa. And he was performing out at Carnival City. And he came into Joburg to get kosher food. So it was a whole thing. Whatever. I won't bore you with the details. But I landed up getting the opportunity to drive him back to his hotel. So it gave us a fair amount of time to talk in the car. And I was very curious about, what this mentalism that he does or whatever. Eventually gave us free tickets also. But that wasn't the point of the conversation. So I wanted to understand, like, how does, obviously it's shtick. There's no such thing as a, I wanted to understand what lies at the core of this mentalist show. So he said it's essentially two things. The one is a decent understanding of nonverbal communication. So you need to be able to throw out bait and then see how people respond to that bait, and then you can read their mind, because effectively you're reading their nonverbal communication. And the other thing is memory techniques. So you have to remember certain things, like, which card did you place in which pocket to pull out afterwards in the envelope and say, oh my gosh, look, it's exactly, memory techniques. Somebody tells you something when you meet them and then they're in the audience, like all that kind of stuff. So this person, prior to getting on stage, was a professor at one of the, I think it might have been Columbia, I don't recall exactly. And one of the courses that he taught was memory enhancement. So we got into a whole conversation about memory. And he asked her, at that time, I thought, I didn't think along these lines, but he asked a really simple but profound question, which was, what is the single greatest event or watershed moment in human history that had the greatest negative impact on human memory? What would you say? In other words, at which point did human memory begin to decline? What would you say?
Could it be the Holocaust?
The Holocaust? Okay, that wouldn't be human memory, that'd be
Inhuman.
Right? What do you think?
Internet.
The internet, right? You'd say the internet, right? Let's see what people are saying over here. Printing.
Calculators.
Printing. So he said the pen, or the quill, or the stylus, or whatever it was, in its original form. Because the moment people had a method to write something down, they no longer had to remember that, whatever it was that they wrote down. And then obviously that expanded when it became the printing press, and much more so today with the internet, and then of course Google, and now AI. So each one of those things has made us lazy in terms of memory. So to put it into very contemporary terms, we all know growing up that you knew phone numbers. You knew people's phone numbers. Today, why would you know anybody's phone number? There's no practical reason to use brain space to remember people's phone numbers. It's a complete waste of time. So why am I saying this? Because back in the Gemara's times, which was before the printing press, if you just think about it, if you're a society that is very focused on learning, which the Jewish people always have been, and which was not common in other societies at the time. Other societies at the time were busy throwing people to the lions for entertainment, while we were developing the Talmud, just, for comparison, right? So in that time, if you're a society that is so fixated on learning and you don't have a means to publish the information, so how do you ensure that people learn? Repetition. If you had gone to school in the time of the Gemara, there wouldn't have been a smart board, there wouldn't have even been a blackboard, there wouldn't have been handouts and sheets. You sat around, and the teacher was the only one who had a copy of the information because it was handwritten, so it was limited. And he'd read, and you'd repeat, and you'd repeat, and you'd repeat, until eventually you consolidated that information. So what we're learning over here is that if you did that repetition 100 times, you had not yet served Hashem. But if you did it 101 times, you were considered somebody who served Hashem. Why? So he explains, the Alter Rebbe continues and explains, the reason is, Mishum Shebi Mayhem, because in that time of the Gemara, the most normal thing in the world at that time was that you would review every chapter that you studied 100 times. Why 100 times? To drill it in. Because they needed to make sure that this information remained, then it was transmitted to the next generation. In fact, the Gemara even tells us about the story of Rabbi Chia, that Rabbi Chia was one of the great sages on the cusp of the Talmudic era, and Rabbi Chia went around And it's a whole story. The Gemara praises him and says, Gedolim Ma'aseh, how great is the activity of what Rabbi Chia did. Basically, he went and he planted fields, and then he harvested, and he was able to have wood, and he was able to have linen, and he was able to make pens, and then he brought sheep, and he cultivated them in the pens until they were at a point where he could shech them, and then he used the skins to make parchment, and then he wrote down the Torah that was being taught at that time, that we know today as the Mishnah and the Gemara. And he split it up, and he had different schools where each school became expert in a particular text, so that there'd be transmission to the next generation. So if you're repeating something 100 times, you become the custodian of that information. And once you've done it 100 times, you are now the resource. You are now the authority. You are the Wikipedia of that generation. So now you've hit success. We've achieved our objective. Did exactly what we were supposed to do. We reviewed and reviewed and reviewed, and it was hard, and it was boring, and it was repetitive, and it was uninspiring, but we did it. 100 times we've hit spiritual success. We have consolidated this chunk of Torah. Now let's move on to the next one. Says the Gemara, now if you learn one more time, that's going to change everything. Because your 100 times till now, that was pragmatic. That was self-serving. That was because we need to preserve Judaism or Torah or information or morality or ethics or whatever you want to call it. And now you've achieved that success. If you go back and learn it again, why would you be learning it again? It's not for you. You've already consolidated the information. It must be for Hashem. So the 101st time, now you are serving Hashem. Right? Now you are serving Hashem. Like the Gemara there gives mashal, an illustration, mishuk shel chamorim, from the early car rental service. So probably you would have thought the earliest car rental service was the Flintstones, but apparently it was donkey rentals. Right? Avis donkey rentals. That's what was going on in those days. So the Gemara uses the donkey rental system as an illustration of how this principle works. What was the story? If you wanted to rent a donkey to carry your load for a distance of 10 parses, so 10 parses is a relatively decent distance, right? It's certainly more than a human would be able to carry a load. So if you wanted to hire a donkey for a distance of 10 parses, the price was 1 zuz. Ulachad asar parse, but if you wanted the donkey to take your load 11 parses, bitrei zuzeh, the price doubled. The price doubled. Says the Gemara, why did the price double? It's only 1 extra parsa. You're increasing the distance by 10%. And yet you're increasing the price by 100%. How does that work? Says the Gemara, why? Because the donkeys were used to traveling 10 parsas and coming home. And therefore to go an extra parsa was not just more effort. It wasn't just further distance. It was out of their reality. That's not how they trained. So if the price doubles. So the Gemara uses that to illustrate that this so-called tipping point where everything changes is not a measure of how much you're doing. It's a measure of how much outside of the ordinary you're doing. You see what a profound concept this is? So let's go back and step out of the Tanya for a second. And let's talk about us. What do we do? By nature, it's just such a human thing to do. We compare. And we create in our own minds, we create some kind of a rating system, some kind of a hierarchy of who's who in the pecking order, who's more spiritually advanced, who's more frum, who's less frum. We've got all these metrics that we use basically to label people, to define people, to create a pecking order. So what do we say? We say, here's so-and-so, and they learn an hour of Gemara every single day, and only then go to work. So they come to shul after the minyan, they don't go home, they sit down, they learn an hour of Gemara together with their study partner, with their chavrusa, and only then do they go to the office. Can you imagine the guy rocks up at the office like at 9 o'clock in the morning? Can you imagine? They say they're very committed. They're very committed. They're very frum. They must be higher up on the pecking order. Whereas somebody else,
And I think that too.
well, sometimes they do, and that's not necessarily a good thing, but yeah, sometimes they do. By contrast, we have another person who davens in the same shul. And after the service is over, they sit down for 5 minutes. And in those 5 minutes, they have their little piece of whatever it is that they study. And then they run off to work, and they're at work by 8, 10. As opposed to other person, they're by 9 o'clock, right? So you look at the two and you say, that person who's learning for an hour, giving Hashem so much nachas, flying at some spiritual altitude, this schlep over here sticks in his little 5 minutes and whatever. What's that worth? So the question is, who here is operating at 100%? And who here is operating at 101%? That's the only question. The question is not how much is the person doing compared to how much is the other person doing. The question is this 100% of their effort, or is this 101% of their effort? Because you know what you'll very likely discover? The person who's sitting for an hour learning Gemara is probably only giving 50%. Because they really could be learning either more or at a greater depth. The person who's learning 5 minutes, that could be one of the most difficult things they've ever had to do in their life, is to commit to 5 minutes every single day when they are burning to go to the office. Maybe they're doing 101%. So the principle over here is never look at the quantity. You always have to look at how much beyond the success rate or the comfort zone is a person operating. So coming back, I've got a donkey. My donkey has a range. It runs for 10 parses and then it comes back. You want my donkey for the 10 parses? That's normal. That's ordinary. We're going to charge you a zuz. Oh, you want it for 11 parses? Sorry, that is wild. That's insane. That's outside of the range. You've broken the mold. You're challenging everything. That's going to cost you double. So the Gemara wants to use that to illustrate. A person who grows up in an environment where the norm is that you review everything that you've learned 100 times is not yet achieving, as long as they've only reviewed 100 times. Yet if that person goes one step more, which is like, I don't see why I should do this, it doesn't make sense, it's beyond my pay roll, it's beyond the expectations, that extra bit is worth more than the 100 times. Or at least as much, right? In the donkey illustration, it's worth as much. The extra kilometer is worth all the 10 kilometers that preceded. So that extra 101st time is worth the 100 times that preceded. So let's go a little further. And therefore, this 101st time of reviewing the information, this, which is one step beyond how the person had been trained, how the person had been habituated from their youth, shkulo keneged kulon. That one time is equal to the 100 times that preceded. I don't think we understand what a profound concept this is. Any little move that I make after success, because 100 is success, right? I've done what I had to. I've done what I was trained to. I've done what I was taught to do. I am the perfect student. I got an A+. I got 100% on the exam. And now that person goes one step further. They have radically changed everything about that experience. Let's put it slightly differently. Let's go further. V'oile al gabehen. That 101st time supersedes the 100 preceding times. Beyeser se'es veyeser ois, with greater strength and greater clout than those 100 times. Okay, so let's take this from another perspective. In a second, he's going to say, and that's what we call Oved Elokim. That's what's called somebody who serves Hashem. But let's just take this from a different perspective for a moment. Imagine that you leave Judaism aside for a second. Let's just talk in plain human interactions. Imagine you have somebody who was getting ready to get married, so they go for these pre-marriage lessons. And in the pre-marriage lessons, the marriage counselor says to the guy, you have to know that it's an appropriate thing to buy your wife flowers for Shabbos. Okay? So he's a very compliant human being. And he makes a mental note, or maybe he makes a note recurring in his diary, or whatever the case is, buy flowers for Shabbos. And every Friday, like clockwork, there he is at the florist. And every Friday, like clockwork, he gets not only the same bunch every week, he's that developed that he even gets different flowers from week to week. And every Friday he walks out and there's somebody who says, oh, you're so dedicated, you're such a good husband, you're getting flowers every single week. And after 20 years of marriage, his wife says, do you love me? And he says, I know what you're talking about. I bring you flowers every single Shabbos. Every Friday I bring you flowers for Shabbos. What do you mean? Why else would I be doing this? Which he should never say, because the obvious reason why he's doing this is because he was told to, not because... Imagine one Friday, he comes home, and instead of flowers, he brings her favorite chocolate. Now her face is going to light up. You actually thought about me. This is no longer just about what you do. This is actually about me. You actually thought about me. You actually paid attention. You actually identified something that I love, and you thought of giving it to me. Does the chocolate cost more than the flowers? Probably not. Probably not. Is it a big fancy piece of jewelry? No. So what changed? What changed is everything. Everything changed. Because up until now, this was about me. I need to be the present husband. I need to be there supporting this relationship. What changed? Now it's about her. 100 times that a person is reviewing the Torah that they've learned, what are they doing? I need to consolidate this information. This is about me. It's about a human being. It's because the human being needs to be able to review and review and review and review until eventually the information is secure. Humans are finite. Therefore, my achievement is finite. But the 101st time, which no longer serves the human endeavor, now I'm doing it. Why? Because I'm obviously dedicated to Hashem. Now I've moved into Hashem's world. Hashem's world is an infinite place. Therefore, that little action has infinite value compared to the 100 actions that preceded it that had finite human value. So imagine if we thought about this any time that we were grappling a little bit with something that we need to do in our Judaism. Well, I don't know if I'm up to it. I don't know if I feel like it. I don't know if I'm ready for it. I think I've done a lot at the moment and maybe I shouldn't be expected to do more. Imagine you reframe that and say, here at this crossroads, at this watershed moment, where there's the possibility of me doing something that I don't feel like doing, that I feel I've done enough times or I've contributed enough to, imagine telling ourselves, that's why I should do it. Because now I'm stepping into Hashem's realm. Because now I'm a servant of Hashem. Because now I'm connected to Hashem. Because now I'm in the infinite realm instead of the finite realm. Imagine how different we'd be. So while the thrust of this chapter is to distinguish for us in the world of the Beinoni between the Oved Elokim and Asheloi Avodoi, between the person who has or has not yet served Hashem, the take-home for us who are not yet at Beinoni status is the single most valuable growth point in our Judaism lies in those things that appear minor but difficult or unattractive, but I've already done this and I can't push myself any further, or whatever it is. Anytime that it's a threshold point of pushing myself to do more than is usual, Nikra Oved Elokim, in that moment I'm serving Hashem. And it's very likely that a lot of my Judaism up until the point is not necessarily serving Hashem, it's doing what Hashem wants. It's not necessarily serving Hashem. Okay, so somebody asked a really good question. So then, does that mean when you reach level 101, you have now started a new process that will then have 100 steps and eventually another 101? And the answer to that is yes. And that's how we consistently have opportunities for radical growth. It's not just that you have one radical growth moment per segment of your Judaism. It's constantly the case. It's what we call the constant leaving of Egypt. Right? That's you're not a prisoner and then free. You're a prisoner and then free, and that becomes your new prison, right? And so it goes, and so we grow.